It is impossible to stop the licentious impulse that is fired by satiety. Can't say that word. And we should all know this. We don't have to rely on Luther or Evagrius. In fact, we can go back to the Apostle Paul, who once linked these two explicitly when he said, do not get drunk on wine, which leads to what? Debauchery. Paul also recognized and knew how these two are linked. And so, which commandment are lust and gluttony associated with? Well, when Luther lines these up, he says pride is in the first and second, lust in the sixth. Yes, we get that, lust in the adulterous commandment. Wrath and hatred in the fifth, gluttony in the sixth. See, that probably wouldn't have struck us as a connection that would be made until we look at this a little deeper. Right? So let's go ahead and put these on the wall here. My method works. It's like doing math in public. All right. With the sixth commandment, as we build our chart here, gluttony and lust are best situated there. So, with 15 minutes to go, we're going to shift to lust. All right? We're going to shift to lust. Now, this one's pretty obviously connected to the sixth commandment. You know the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "You have heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with what? Lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Okay? If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out, etc. So, very explicitly, Jesus in Scripture, it's not too hard to tell, recognize adultery is fueled by the vice of lust, sexual desire. Right? So what does the Bible have to say about lust, and by nature then, marriage, and the sixth commandment? Here's a really good place to go, and I actually just did this with a pair of folks. This past week we talked about this. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 7, has some very practical advice for us. And he says, "But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband." You all know what that means. Look at this. "For the wife does not even have authority over her own body, but the husband does." And then, likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. "Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, so that you could devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." Paul knows we are by nature people who have sexual desires, and he's saying there's a remedy for that. It's marriage. And even within marriage, a wife or a husband should not deprive one another, because if they do, what's that going to lead to? It's going to fuel the fires of lust and possibly damage a marriage relationship by creating, extramarital activity. We watched this thing by Bruce Wilkinson. Angela and I were first married in Dayton, Ohio, and there was this old 90s segment on biblical portrait of marriage. Anybody ever heard of this? Bruce Wilkinson, I believe, did it. And he said, he interprets this passage to mean the only time a husband and wife should not have sex is if both of them don't want to, right? Now, he might have been pushing that a little far, but I see where he gets that from here. And why? So that Satan does not tempt you. He says, "But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry." He's talking about widows here. "For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this charge, not I but the Lord. The wife should not separate from her husband. If she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. And the husband should not divorce his wife." And of course, this is a reflection of Jesus' teaching in Matthew 19:9 that says, "I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, and marries another, commits adultery." So even those who have been prior married and separate for the wrong reasons, to then go take someone else and have sexual relations, then would be adulterers as well, you see. Because lust erodes the marriage bond that's intended to be created between husband and wife. Okay? Let's see what Luther says about marriage here as he reflects. He says marriage is not just an honorable walk of life, but a necessary one. It is solemnly commanded by God that in general, Both men and women in all walks of life who have been created for it should be found in this walk of life. To be sure, there are some, albeit rare, exceptions whom God has especially exempted, and that some are unsuited for married life, or others God has released by a high supernatural gift so that they can maintain chaste outside of marriage. Luther says the only way you're going to remain chaste outside of marriage is if you have a supernatural gift that's very, very rare. Where nature functions as God intended it, however, it is not possible to remain chaste outside of marriage. Therefore, he says, to make it easier for people to avoid unchastity in some measure, God established marriage so that all may have their allotted portion. Yes, Luther is talking about that there, even though he doesn't use the words, and be satisfied with it, although here too, God's grace is still required to keep the heart pure. But even marriage is not a foolproof solution to the vice of lust. So I want to talk first about lust within marriage, which is probably a new concept for many of us. And then I want to talk about lust outside of marriage and even how lust perverts marriage. And then I think that's about time to begin. So, new concept here. Can a husband and wife exercise lust within their own marriage and desire for each other? In a couple of ways, yes. Twin temptations. First, degrading sexual pleasure into a meaningless base instinct. This would be to treat one's partner as a mere means to pleasure rather than an individual with dignity. Okay? So, marriage and sexual relations are the two joining in one in mutual respect and admiration for one another. It is not just, right, for pleasure and pleasure alone, regardless of the expense of the other. If it devolves into that, even within marriage, lust is rearing its ugly head. Another thing, and I think this is especially common in younger generations today, elevating sex to an ecstasy to be pursued by any means. When there's a world devoid of spirituality, or an awareness of God's presence, or the mystical, or the unseen, and the only thing left is the ecstasy you can experience through sexual relations, that becomes the new spiritual. That becomes the new escape. That becomes the new way to connect or be in touch with something other or outside of what we physically see. And I think you see that trend happening in the youth of today. It almost takes on a religious nature. A little quote by Buechner here that kind of thing gets at this. He says, sex is sinful to the degree that instead of drawing you closer to other human beings in their humaneness, it unites bodies but leaves the lives inside them hungrier and more alone than before. Okay? So I would just encourage married folks, if they're feeling alone in these moments in their marriage, that they communicate about that they discuss that they rekindle and redefine what sexuality looks like within their marriage. Okay? So I wanted to start there because the next two are easy to beat on. And I just wanted us to be self-reflective before we look at how lust happens outside of marriage. You obviously could probably teach this chart. The most obvious example is infidelity, or cheating as it's commonly called. That's extramarital sex. Also, I'm hearing about it more and more. We have open marriage. If my spouse wants to have sexual relations with someone else that they're not married to, I'm okay with that because they're okay with that for me. Totally degrades the marriage bond. I would like to see how long any of those kinds of marriages could possibly last. Multiple partners, obviously, pornography. Lust is a sin of the eyes, okay? It does not need to express itself in physical intimacy to be considered lustful. And then also sexual activity before or after marriage. The college culture of hooking up or one-night stands, maybe it's not even limited to college anymore, and also then the big one that I wrestle with every day as a pastor, cohabitation, right? If anything's going to make me take this collar off and walk away from this job, it's being expected to turn the other way to cohabitation. Just because that's what the world's doing, and so guess what? Accept it, pastor, or you're going to wreck this place. And I was warned about that before I got into ministry. I asked Pastor Mark Wine, my prior pastor, before I got into the ministry, I said, what's the hardest thing you've ever done? And he said, I wouldn't marry the president of the congregation's daughter, because they were living together, and he was my best friend, and he left the church and disowned me forever. And he said, to this day, I can't get over that in ministry. And So it's not like I didn't have fair warning. Guys, Hugh Hefner said his greatest legacy was that he took what used to be called shacking up and made it just the normal way of life in America. Do we want to follow Hugh Hefner's legacy or Jesus? That's what I would say to that. All right? The Bible speaks specifically about sexual sin. He says every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but the sexually immoral person sins against his own body. Or do you not know that your whole body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own. You were bought with a price, so glorify God with your body. What's the big thing today, right? It's their body, it's their choice. It doesn't hurt anybody else. And Paul says, oh no, it hurts the most important person you should care about. You. Your own flesh and blood. All right, that's why this is such a big deal. The reason there's taboos around sexuality in every culture is because people recognize there is a sacred aspect to it that when violated leaves us wounded, often for life. Hebrews 13:4 is kind of a throwaway verse in Hebrews, not that it's throwaway, it kind of appears like out of nowhere, no context. Let the marriage bed be held in honor by all, let the marriage be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral. Okay? So lust can exercise itself within marriage, obviously causes us to be sexually immoral outside of marriage, and then also lust perverts marriage. We can analyze the current cultural moment of redefining marriage and gender fluidity and all this kind of stuff in a lot of different ways. But at the end of the day, same-sex relations come down to the same thing as sexually immoral, different sex relations, right? It's all driven by lust. In fact, Paul says, if you want to know what's going on with homosexuality, look no further than lust. Romans 1. God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies with themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. So it's the lust of their hearts. See, for this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. For the women exchanged their natural relations with those that are contrary to nature, and men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion, lust for one another, men committing shameless acts with men, and receiving themselves the due penalty for their error. So it's not that hard to figure out what's going on here. This is just sexual desire exercising itself at all costs and outside the bonds of a marriage and the union between male and female. And what that should do, though, is wake us up and realize that, homosexuality, as much as we maybe find that deplorable or hang that up as a poster child of disobedience to God, it's really not any different than a lustful male or female exercising their own passions outside of the marriage bond either. You see, they're both driven by the same thing, a desire to please me and me now at all costs, regardless of what God's design is. And so if we want the church or the world to take seriously what the church says about marriage, we have to get a lot more serious about what we say about marriage according to God's design. Right? I've said this before, right? I saw a bumper sticker like 10 years ago, big rainbow on it, and it says, if we can't get married, you can't get divorced. Right? Kind of like take the log out of your own eye before you pull the speck out of mine. All right. I know, I feel like I'm hammering it. I feel like this is a fire and brimstone sermon. Let's turn it around a little bit. What's at stake in lust? Why is it such a big deal? God-pleasing exercising of created sexuality cements the bonds of a one-flesh union in marriage. Love as God intended it is at stake with lust. Also, what is that union of male and female for the purpose of? Ultimately, be fruitful and multiply, fulfilling the first great commission, creating new human beings, bringing families into the world. Here's what's at stake with lust. Nothing less than love in its highest form and life itself. The natural result of sex is to bind us inextricably to others beyond ourselves and beyond the limits of our lifetime. Right? We create people with eternal souls who will be recognized as our flesh and blood for all eternity. Lust, on contrast, turns sex into a party for one. I want my pleasure. There's the I, say the lustful now. But what they receive is a sham, shallow, and empty version of gratification. So what is at stake if we take our sexuality lightly is that we risk destroying and perverting relationships that are eternal in nature and the very fundamental core of God's design for humanity. Now, the ancients had a lot of sympathy for lust. They considered it sort of light. I mean, it certainly wasn't as bad as envy. And I think you'll realize that too when we cover envy, right? When we cover envy, you'll want to crawl under the tiles of this floor and get out of this room, right? But I think the ancients couldn't have foreseen the kind of culture we have in modern day America today that's been enabled largely by technology. See, we have divorced the sex act from necessarily bringing forth children into the world through technology, birth control, contraceptives, etc. And that has created a revolution in how we view sexuality unlike any other period in the history of the entire world. Right? And it's important for us to remember that as the church in the midst of this. The technology changes, but always the technology amplifies the ability to which we can sin. We've got to remember what it's for. All right, let's hear from Luther one more time, and then let's look at our final virtue. Sorry, big quote from Luther. I like hearing from Luther. For even though man has become righteous, he is not yet completely rid of evil lusts. To be sure, faith has begun to subdue the flesh, but the flesh continues to bestir itself and rages, nevertheless, in all sorts of lusts that would like to assert themselves again and again and do what they want. Therefore, the Spirit must busy itself daily to tame the flesh and to bring it into subjection. Must wrestle with it incessantly and must take care that it does not repel faith. Therefore, those who say that they have faith think this is enough. And in addition, live as they please and are deceiving themselves. Where faith is genuine, it must attack the body and hold it in check, lest the body do what it pleases. This is part 4 of baptism, the small catechism. Daily drown the old man in his desires, so that the new man, or woman, if you will rise up and live in righteousness and purity. One more from the Galatians commentary from 1535. Those who are addicted to such debauchery, which is more degraded than the behavior of animals, again, tie in there with gluttony, should know that they are not spiritual, regardless of their boasting, but that they are following the flesh and are performing its works. Such people heard the dreadful sentence pronounced upon them that they shall not inherit the kingdom of God. Thus, Paul wants Christians to avoid drunkenness and intoxication and to live a sober and frugal life, lest a well-fed flesh provoke them into wantonness. For the flesh is usually powerfully stimulated after excessive drinking and gluttony, yet it is not sufficient to restrain only the violent sexual appetite that accompanies intoxication, but even a sober flesh must be held in control, lest it gratify its desires. Okay? So if you mind Luther deep enough, he talks about this stuff all the time. We're used to all the justification by faith and no works and all that kind of stuff, and that's all great. But when it gets down to brass tacks, living our life, Luther has a lot to say about how we need to deny the sinful self and what it wants from us. So what is the opposite of lust? Anybody know what they call it? Chastity, yeah. I have an old-fashioned word here. Chastity. So, temperance and chastity.